Welcome back. So in the last video, we talked about all of the vocab words you see on this screen, right? We talked about interior and exterior, and alternate interior angles, alternate exterior angles, and so on and so on. So what's the point of this video? Well, this video is now going to explore these angles and say, hey, what's the relationship between 4 and 6? What's the relationship between 2 and 7? Okay, so I'm actually going to start over here with the corresponding angles. So look what I did for angle 1. Angle 1, I've highlighted it in purple. So if I take angle 1, if I take that purple and I translate it down the transversal, so remember, translate means like shift. If I take it and I pull it down the transversal, do you see how it matches exactly with angle 5? So when I'm looking here at my corresponding angles, I should be able to see that angles 1 and 5, yes, they have to be congruent. Okay, so this time let's look at angles 2 and 6. Now I've highlighted angle 2. So let's see what happens when I translate angle 2 down my transversal. Oh wait, angle 6 is exactly the same measure as angle 2. So therefore angles 2 and 6 also must be congruent. So this time let's look at angles 4 and 8. Same thing, here's angle 4. So let's take angle 4 and translate it down the transversal. Oh, what do you know? 4 and 8, again, they are congruent. Okay, last one. Let's take a look at angles 3 and 7. The pattern here would suggest that they're congruent, but I want to see it for myself. So angle 3, if I translate it down my transversal, there it is. Angle 3 and angle 7 must have the exact same measure, which means they're also congruent. Okay, so look what we just found out. If these lines are in fact parallel, then all of the pairs of my corresponding angles are congruent. Now, would that hold if the lines aren't parallel? That remains to be seen. But right now, I know if these lines are in fact parallel, corresponding angles must be congruent. Okay, so let's look at a pair of alternate interior angles. I've gone ahead and marked angle 4. Now, this is going to be a little trickier for me because I've got to compare 4 and 6. But let's see, what do you think? Are they congruent? Well, 4 and 8, they're definitely congruent. We saw that. They're corresponding angles. And now look at 6 and 8, those are vertical angles. So we know they're congruent. So angle 4 is in fact congruent to angle 6. So this time, let's look at angles 3 and 5. 4 and 6 were congruent. How about 3 and 5? Well, 3 and 7 we know are congruent because they are corresponding angles. And 5 and 7 are vertical angles. So we know that 5 and 7 also are congruent. So if 3 is congruent to 7, 7 is congruent to 5, it leads me to believe, yes, 3 and 5 are in fact congruent. Okay, so let's see about angles 1 and 7, our alternate exterior angles. Alternate interior angles, they both came out congruent, but how about these guys? So I've gone ahead and marked 1. Let's see what happens. 1 and 5, we know they're congruent because they are corresponding angles, and of course my lines are parallel. But 5 and 7 are congruent because they're vertical angles. So 1's congruent to 5, 5's congruent to 7. That leads me to the conclusion that 1 in fact is congruent to 7. Okay, so 2 and 8, let's see it. Here's angle 2 so you can visualize. 2's congruent to 6, we know this. Well, 6 is congruent to 8 by vertical angles, so yes, 2 is congruent to 8. All right, let me pause for a second. Here's what we know. We know if these lines are parallel, then all the pairs of corresponding angles are congruent. If these lines are parallel, then both pairs of alternate interior angles are congruent. If these lines are parallel, then both pairs of alternate exterior angles are congruent. So what happens now if they're not alternating sides of the transversal, but they're same side of the transversal? We've got 4 more pairs. Okay, so I've started with angle 4. If I take angle 4 and I slide it down, okay, we know 4 and 8 are congruent. But I'm not asking about 4 and 8. I'm asking about 4 and 5. Well, wait a minute. That doesn't work. So I know 4 is congruent to 8, right? We know that. But look what happens. 8 and 5 aren't congruent. So if 8 and 5 aren't congruent, so now what? Okay, they're not congruent angles, but there still is a relationship between 5 and 4. So look at this closely. If 4 and 8 are congruent, which they are, okay, we know that, we've been there 100 times. Well, 5 and 8, they're supplementary angles. So if 4 and 8 are congruent, but 5 and 8 are supplementary, that means that 4 and 5 also must be supplementary. Okay, so let's go ahead and see 3 and 6. So here's 3, I went ahead and marked it. We know that 3 and 7 are going to be congruent because, again, they're corresponding angles, but are 7 and 6 necessarily congruent? No, they are not. So if they're not congruent, we have to look for another relationship that exists. 7 and 6, they're supplementary angles. They form this straight line right here. So 3 and 7 are congruent, but 6 and 7 are supplementary. So that means now that 3 and 6 must also be supplementary. All right, here we go, 1 and 8. So angle 1, congruent to angle 5, thank you, if parallel lines and corresponding angles are congruent. But 5 and 8 don't have to be congruent. They could be, but in this situation, they're absolutely not. And I'm looking for something that will hold always. So not congruent, we need to figure out a relationship. So 1 and 5 we know are congruent. 5 and 8 we know are supplementary. That leads me to saying that 1 and 8 are now supplementary. Okay, last one, and then we can sum this up. So 2 and 7. Here I've started at 2. 2, I'm going to slide it down the transversal. So 2 is for sure congruent to 6. But is 6 congruent to 7? Doesn't look it, because it's not. So 6 and 7 are not congruent. We need a relationship between them. And the relationship between them is that they are supplementary. So 2 is congruent to 6, but 6 is supplementary to 7. So now I can say, well, 2 and 7, they're going to be supplementary angles. Okay, before I wrap it up, I just want to put a number in and make sure everybody's with me on the same page with the supplementary. I'm pretty sure the congruents are self-explanatory, but let's explore this real quick with numbers. Let's say angle 2 is 50 degrees, okay? If that's true, then as soon as I translate it down, angle 6 is also 50 degrees. Okay, this 50 degrees gets me this 50 degrees, but these guys here are for sure supplementary. There's a straight angle. So angle 7 is 130. But now, look at the relationship between angle 2 and angle 7 out here. Okay, they're not congruent angles, but they are in fact still supplementary. So that's the supplementary. All right, so to wrap it up and to put words to it and make it all formal, here we go. If parallel lines, then alternate interior angles are congruent. If parallel lines, then alternate exterior angles are congruent. If parallel lines, then corresponding angles are congruent. Yes, I went out of order. If parallel lines, then same side interior angles are sub. If parallel lines, then same side exterior angles are sub. These 5 statements are things you need to know for this upcoming test. Okay, I'm sorry, I know this video is dragging a little bit, but stay with me. I want to quickly look at what happens when the lines aren't parallel. What happens when the lines are going to intersect? Are my alternate interior angles, are they still congruent? Look at 4 and 6, are they congruent? Maybe. Well, maybe it doesn't work for me. How do I know if these angles are congruent? How do I know if 4 and 6 are congruent? Again, I'm going to go back to a pair of corresponding angles. Let's look at 1 and 5. Okay, so let's test a pair of corresponding angles. Remember, this is really all I need to test because all of these relationships, we started with a pair of corresponding angles first. So let's test angle 1 and angle 5. If I take angle 1 and I translate it down, hey, wait a minute. Angle 1 and angle 5 aren't congruent. But if angle 1 and angle 5 aren't congruent, that means that none of my corresponding angles are congruent, which means my alternate interiors can't be congruent. My alternate exteriors can't be congruent, and all my same side angles can't be supplementary. So if these lines are not parallel, none of the relationships hold. Okay, if the lines aren't parallel, then none of my relationships hold. That's what we've been saying. The angles aren't congruent, the angles aren't supplementary. The names still hold. Angles 4 and 6, those are still alternate interior angles. They just aren't congruent because the lines aren't parallel. So the relationships fail, but the names still hold. It is super, super important that you understand the difference between the names and their relationships.